there was a beggar, a homeless person there on the sidewalk asking for money. So the man of our story, he pulled out his wallet and he looked at what he had, and he told the beggar, I have $168. I'm going to give you $167, but I'm going to keep $1 so that I can catch the bus back home. So he went ahead and gave the beggar $167, kept $1, and he turned around to go to the post office, and the beggar went after him with a baseball bat and hit him in the back of the head, knocked him unconscious, and stole the dollar that the man had kept. And my question to you is, what do you think of that beggar? How could we describe him? And I guess we should keep words that we can use in church. What would you say of him? Greedy, ungrateful, mean, disloyal. I mean, you can find so many things because of the unfairness of that act. After all, he got $167. Have you heard anybody give a beggar $167? You know, they have a sign like 50 cents would do or whatever, but, you know, like $1 would be kind of basic. But he received a lot. In law, if we would bring him before a judge, that would be like aggravating circumstances, because he not only was guilty of battery, but he was guilty of battery under particular circumstances where the person he battered had been very generous to him. So probably the sentence will be a little more stiff. It would be a little bigger because of what he did and the circumstances of what he did. And I know that the older we get, we tend to be more compassionate with people like that because we try to justify it in some way. Maybe he wasn't well or whatever. If you talk to kids, they would say, electric chair, get rid of someone like that. You know, they don't want someone like that in the world today. Anybody good in math? How many of you aced all your math exams? All right. How many hours in a week? You would have to multiply 7 times 24. And if you're good in math, it will be 168. And how many hours is God asking from us on a weekly basis? 1. The hour that we spend here at Mass. That's what he asks of us. Well, every time we miss Mass, we do just like the beggar. That we tell God, you've given me 167 hours, and you have kept 1 hour for yourself, but I'm going to hit you in the back of the head, and I'm going to take that hour for myself. But I know I'm preaching to the choir here, because after all, you're here at Mass. So, but before you begin boasting too quickly, 1 hour is the minimum. That's the minimum. Actually, every hour of the week, in whatever way we employ those hours, they should be God's. And the reason is that the moment that we recognize how much God has given to us, then we can't help it but to give back to Him. That's the whole point of the little story of the 167 hours. The moment we recognize how much we receive from God, then we want to give Him back. That's such a normal, natural, human reaction. Think about it in your own life. If someone is nice to you, don't you like to repay that kindness? Don't you like to do something for that person? Whenever that person needs something, you remember what that person did, and there's no problem for you being very accommodating to that person. So my suspicion is that we don't do all we could do for God because we really, if we're honest, we don't recognize how much God has done for us. The moment we recognize that, we couldn't help but be part of God. We couldn't help but be at the service of God. So when you look at empty churches, basically that would be a good reason, because there may be a lot of people out there that have no clue how much God is doing for them. Every breath we take, every heartbeat is from God. He sustains us alive. And the moment we recognize that, we want to give Him more and more. It's obvious that the theme for the liturgy today is that the house of God is a house of prayer for all people. St. Paul in the second reading reminds us that he's the apostle to the Gentiles. In the gospel, we see a Canaanite woman, a pagan. She wasn't Jew. Yet it's interesting. Did you notice how she calls Jesus? He calls Jesus Son of David, which is a messianic title. It is recognizing who Jesus is in the Jewish world. And yet, it's an interesting exchange there. We'll get into that in a minute. But that is kind of like the basic theme, that God's house is a house for all peoples. But we're not going to fill God's house unless we realize how much God has done for us. It's the natural response to a loving, caring, giving God. And, you know, cycle A, that we're in cycle A, we use the Gospel of Matthew on Sundays. It's really interesting because during the weekdays, we have also Matthew's Gospel. So we kind of go back and forth in the Gospel of Matthew. Sometimes we race a little faster during the weekday Masses, and then we backtrack during the Sunday Masses. But if you notice during the week, and if you went to daily Mass, for example, you would notice that a lot of the themes had to do with how much we owe God. Wednesday particularly was an interesting reading. It was the reading, Wednesday Gospel, of the debtor that owed a huge amount to the king. And if you remember that parable of Jesus, the king forgave the debtor because he begged him to forgive him. But then when he went out, he saw a man that owed him a mere fraction of what he owed the king. And yet he grabbed him by the neck, he asked him to repay the debt, and he didn't forgive the debt. He put him in prison, and then he scandalized everybody else who knew what the king had done for this man, and what he wasn't willing to do for someone who owed him a mere fraction of what he owed. And then, of course, he has to face the consequences with the king again. What is interesting of that parable, in the translations, they only say that he owed a huge amount, but they don't give you the original language. In the original Greek, it says that he owed the king 10,000 talents. And of course, that's not part of the translation, either in English or in Spanish, because we have no idea what a talent is. When we say a talent, it's not the gifts that we have, the abilities that we have, but a talent in the time of Jesus, it was a financial number. It was a financial money. It meant money. And I'll give you what a talent was so that you get the idea. One talent. It was worth 15 years, 15 years of an average workman's salary. So think about that. You know, just think of your own salary, whatever you work for or you had worked in the past for. This was my annual salary. And multiply that by 15. That would be 1 talent. Think how many years you could live like that. You know, if you could be with 1 talent, 15 years. Now, the number that is given in the gospel is 10,000 talents. Can you believe that? 10,000 talents. 1 is 15 years of no work. That sounds pretty good. But 10,000 talents, that's the image, that's the figure that Jesus uses for what this man owed the king. And then the one he met in the street owed him a mere fraction of what he owed. And yet he wasn't willing to forgive. And you see the point of that parable that was that Jesus makes that exaggeration so that we realize that we owe God so much that forgiving someone else should be nothing. God has forgiven us so much, 10,000 talents, that forgiving half a talent means nothing, because we have 10,000 that we have been forgiven for. And it's the same thing. It's recognizing what God has done for us. If you miss Mass next weekend, basically what you're saying is, I don't really recognize what God has done for me. I can stay here. I don't need to do anything for God. And I know you're not in that category, and maybe most people don't think like that, but that's actually what we're doing. And that's what responding to God's grace is all about. With the Canaanite woman, she gives us another perspective, which is the perspective of prayer, because she is persistent and she is creative. And that's important. She persists. She begs Jesus. She continues to tell Jesus. It's a beautiful story, because if you notice, Jesus doesn't pay attention to her. And I can almost imagine the disciples. They're watching Jesus. They realize that he's not saying anything to her. So now they feel that they can say something. And they say, Lord, send her away. She's bothering us. And then Jesus gives an answer. He says, I came for the children of Israel. But she persists. She comes and she kneels before him. And she says, Lord, help me. And he says, it is not right to give the food of the children to the dogs. But then she had an answer. Immediately she says, but Lord, even the dogs eat the scraps that fall from the master's table. And Jesus then gives it. He tells her, your faith is great. Let it be done as you wish. And the daughter is healed. Interesting notion, because when you hear that, you say, that was kind of mean. You don't call people a dog. That's pretty bad. And Jesus, of course, of all people, he shouldn't call anybody a dog. But in a way, he is engaging her in conversation. And when you read the interpretation of that passage, you will find definitely that he did use the word dog. And for the Jewish people, a dog was not like the pet we have at home that is kind of part of the family, that we cry when he dies or she dies and we bury them. Well, that was not the notion for the Jewish people. Dogs were a nuisance. They were street dogs. They were everywhere. And they would just try to take advantage of whatever they could get to eat, etc. And of course, it was not an animal that was well seen by the Jewish people. But there's another interpretation. It is the interpretation that in the Canaanite world, which is in other translations or in other synoptics, Syro-Phoenicia, which is part of Syria, they had actually, in the pagan cults, a cult of the dogs. They have found, archaeologists, cemeteries of dogs. Not just one dog that was buried by the owner because he had to bury the dog, but cemeteries full of dogs because they were used in some of the pagan rites. So when Jesus alludes to a dog, he was basically telling this woman, I know what you do. I know what you're about. He was uncovering that. Think about it. It makes sense. Because if he was insulting her and calling her a dog, then you wouldn't persist. You would just leave or maybe insult him back. But she doesn't do that. She understands. He is engaging her in a conversation so that she can understand better who she is and that he knows about her. That's a beautiful image of prayer, because when we go to prayer, we're not really doing anything for God. God is God, and we are not. But when we go to prayer, we learn about ourselves. I had a spiritual director in seminary. He always used to say, the Bible is the only book we don't read. The Bible reads us. You see that the direction is the other way. I'm not reading the Bible. When I read the Bible is reading my life. It's telling me about my life. It's challenging me about things. And I'm getting to know myself better. And that's that whole passage there, that whole dynamic that helps us to understand who God is and how good God is to us. So let us pray for that. today as we learn a little bit from those beautiful passages that yes, the house of God is a house of prayer for all people. God sent his Son not only for Christians, he sent his Son for everybody. Everybody is saved through him. It doesn't matter what religion you're in. It doesn't matter if you believe or not. The Son of God died for you. And as we recognize that, then we really understand what filling up the house of God is all about. What responding to his great love is all about. And if you have a problem with that, just meditate today. Think of the 167. Think of the 10,000 talents. And think of the persistence of that woman who was not a Jew, but she knew how much she needed God in her life. And hopefully we can do the same. Amen.